Welcome, folks. I'm Tim Wickberg. I'm the Chief Technology Officer for SCID-MD, and I'm here to talk to you guys about the Slurm roadmap. Specifically, the most recent release, Slurm 22.05, the next upcoming release, Slurm 23.02, and then beyond into the future. So, thank you guys for participating in the Slurm User Group Meeting 2022. This is where we are in the agenda, 12:30. This is the last of the live presentations for today. There is going to be one more presentation that will be available to watch whenever, starting at 2 p.m. We're not doing that one as a premiere, so there's no live chat associated with that one. The video will just become available at that point. So, 7, actually now 8 presentations with that one late edition. Through different streams. They're all here. Obviously, if you're responding and chatting to me in the chat right now, you've figured it out. Thank you for your cooperation and patience with the sort of quirkiness of the YouTube platform for doing these conferences. For questions, I am actually reading the live chat this time. My moderators aren't sitting in between. Feel free to ask questions throughout. They'll try to answer stuff as best they can, or I may try to answer them live as I see them pop up. So, 22.05. So we made the 22.05 release back in May. As a lot of you may know, Slurm is released on a 9-month cadence. And that 9-month cadence is baked right into our version numbers. Slurm 22.05 was released in the 5th month of 2022. That's where the version number comes from. The next version will be 23.02. That is February of 2023. And that will be followed by 23.11 in the following November. This is one thing where I do see folks occasionally use a shorthand of just 1 digit for the Slurm version number, and that's not quite correct. Especially for the year 2023, there's actually going to be a pair of releases, and it's kind of important to tell the difference between that 23.02 release and then that following 23.11. So, since the last time we've done this, we have made that release, 22.05. This is going to recap a lot of the new features and changes that we've introduced there. First, we have this new idea of a preferred or soft constraint. This complements the constraint model that Slurm's had for a long time through -- constraint, which operates off of a list of features that have been defined on your compute nodes. To allow your users to have a bit of influence over where their jobs are placed within the system. Especially for more heterogeneous environments, this is quite powerful to let the users steer their workload without needing to configure endless numbers of different partitions targeting specific discrepancies in successive generations of equipment. This also then comes in alongside the cloud environments a lot to help you have ways to distinguish between different instance types. This can be used for other things like dynamic node features through the node features plugin. The traditional hard constraint model is an absolute set of requirements for the job. This new -- prefer option comes in alongside that, and when the job goes to launch, if we are able to satisfy that prefer set of same constraint logic, we'll use that as an additional layer beyond those hard constraints. But at the same time, if we can't immediately satisfy that, we will still launch the job on whatever nodes are available. So this is a preference that the job can express. It's not a hard set of requirements. Next, we've introduced cgroup v2 support. The Linux kernel has pivoted very hard to cgroup v2. And a lot of Linux distributions are starting to deprecate or disable cgroup v1 support by default. So Slurm now supports v2 with about 90% feature parity to the original v1 implementation. There's a few subtleties in the new v2 interface that don't quite map to relatively uncommon features of v1. So there are a few caveats there. Please check the release notes if those may apply to you. With this new v2 plugin, if it's been built and compiled in, it will auto-detect and try to determine if the cgroup subsystem on your machine is mounted as a v1 or v2, and it will default to running in v2 mode if it's available on your machine. Backfill for licenses. So Slurm has the concept of a license. These can be used to model software licenses, or they can be used to model really anything about your cluster, any resource that you want to track and manage, but that isn't directly attached to a specific compute node. So I have seen sites use this to represent scratch disk capacity on a global file system, to represent network bandwidth in and out of the center, and a lot of different sort of other aspects of your general cluster environment that aren't things that are directly attached to specific nodes. One important caveat that's kind of long lurked there, though, is that the backfill scheduling in Slurm, which is responsible for sort of interleaving a lot of lower priority work and keeping your system utilization up, has never had support for tracking and managing those licenses through time. This means that in systems that don't turn on this new functionality, if you have stuff with a higher priority that is blocked pending on licenses, it might inadvertently be starved. It may have the compute resources it needs backfilled out to other compute jobs that can launch immediately that aren't blocked on licenses, while it still sits there and waits for sort of a perfect opening for those licenses to be available. Obviously, this is not ideal. So in Slurm 22.05, there is a new option, this scheduler parameter BF licenses, that will tell the scheduler to explicitly track, manage, and backfill around the expected license utilization on your system. This does come at a slight cost. The more work the scheduler does, the more work it has to do. But at least so far, we've seen only kind of minor performance differences from running with this enabled. I will note it is disabled unless you've turned this on explicitly in your slurm.conf. And that will remain true at least through the 23.02 release. Sometime further down, we may actually move to enabling this by default, but currently it is off, but available as a new option to turn on in 22.05. Another thing that came in is this idea of a GPU shard. This is sort of related, but not equivalent to MIG support for NVIDIA GPUs or for MPS support. This is a way for your users to cooperatively share a GPU or any other generic resource type. As an admin, you go through and define the number of these shards or slices, you can use that terminology somewhat interchangeably, that you want to make available, and then users can request specific counts of those as part of their job submission. The scheduler will track, manage, and respect this and make sure that proportionally the jobs that are running on the system fit in that model. But the important caveat to this is there's no hardware enforcement of this restriction. If you've defined a GPU with 7 slices and a user requests 4, the understanding is that user in their job needs to have some way that it's actually limiting it to, say, 4/7 of the resource on that card. There is no specific enforcement action behind that. So it's really only designed for sort of friendly environments with a well-known user base that are able to cooperatively share these resources. It's not something that I'd recommend for sort of university, national lab type environments where your users might push the limits on kind of how much of that resource they can use there and might edge each other out a bit. Another new plugin that came in is called this AcctGatherInterconnect sysfs. The AcctGatherInterconnect plugins are ways to gather accounting data off of an interconnect. Traditionally, we've had one available for OFED to pull InfiniBand stats. But this new sysfs one can work with sort of any device that presents a fairly generic interface through the Linux sysfs pseudo file system. And we can pull those statistics off of there if this is set up and configured, and then track and tie them back to the appropriate compute job. Another sort of minor but subtle change that's come in with 22.05 is a tweak to the definition of LLN. LLN, short for least loaded node, is an option that you can enable on the partition to tell Slurm to spread workload out throughout all of the compute nodes in that partition. Otherwise, by default, Slurm is always trying to pack the workload into as few nodes as it can to try and leave the greatest number of complete nodes available to a hypothetical future large job that needs to come and occupy the system. So when you turn this LLN flag on, you're telling Slurm, spread everything out by default instead. I'm not worried about trying to preserve access. I'm more worried about just trying to spread the load. But there's been kind of an important caveat to that, which is that the working definition for the load on a node in the past has only been about how many idle cores are actually available. So a system with more idle cores was defined as being least loaded. In a heterogeneous system, if you had a node with 128 cores, and then you could have 50 compute nodes each with 8 cores, the definition of LLN is kind of counterintuitive, and that Slurm would actually go and take that 128 core box and load 120 of those cores before it was considered as loaded as anything else in that partition. Instead, this is a subtle update to the definition for LLN. It's going to be the proportion of allocated cores to total cores within the node, which sort of matches people's intuition for kind of how loaded a given system may be. So another small tweak lives over in the Slurm database. This is a way to flip on accounting without defaults. So this is a new option buried in the slurmdbd.conf that allows you to turn off Slurm's usual sanity checks. Generally, the slurmdbd, and enforced in conjunction with the S-Account Manager tooling or the REST API, are making sure that every user has a default account so that when they do an S-batch, an S-run, that they don't always have to explicitly specify what account they want that to run under. The downside is for folks doing a lot of scripting and trying to tie the database back to some other system at their site that's tracking and managing user and accounting. That additional caveat kind of makes it very difficult to do a lot of that scripting because you have to add new accounts, change the default account around before potentially removing their old default account. Instead, this is a way to just say, no, turn it off, turn off this automatic sort of sanity check. I'll handle it, or I'm also willing to just make sure my users manually specify their accounts all the time if a default isn't available for them at job submission. So subtle tweak, but one that we expect will make at least some site integrations a little bit simpler for the sysadmins. Some more tweaks to the slurmscriptd. The slurmscriptd is a process that lives in conjunction with the Slurm controller, whose entire job is to execute hooks on behalf of the Slurm controller. We found, after doing some profiling in older releases, that the overhead of fork and exec directly out of the Slurm controller process can actually be huge, especially on higher throughput, higher node count environments where just the page table copies that fork exec has to deal with behind the scenes can actually be massive and can dramatically reduce the throughput of the Slurm controller. So we created this new process that lives alongside it, whose entire job is just to do the fork exec, but do it in a process with a minimal memory footprint and something that's not tying up the thread level concurrency that the Slurm controller is used to running with. We moved a number of hooks into that slurmscriptd already, but we're continuing to push this. And in 22.05, one of the more significant ones we moved is the mail program. So for sites that do use that extensively, that can actually be a massive throughput limit on your Slurm controller. Moving the mail program into the slurmscriptd fixes a lot of those performance caveats. It does let you run that in an even higher throughput environment than was previously available. As folks have talked about, I believe Jason earlier today mentioned some of this around the batch and environment storage. We had added the capability to store a user's batch script, a user's job environment in the Slurm database. But that was done in the main job table, which we found can lead to some performance concerns for a lot of systems. Also, for users that are making heavy use of job arrays, for example, it meant that every row in that table was getting an independent copy of that job script. So we made some adjustments, and we now store those in a separate table, and just the hash of the batch script environments are stored in the job table itself, which also then lets us deduplicate those scripts. So if you have users submitting especially large scripts constantly, where that script may be identical, this can take a little bit of load off of the MySQL MariaDB instance. We also do store this new last use timestamp in the table. This gives us something where we can purge those job scripts at a future point in time if somebody wants to clear those out and reclaim some space in the database. Then another rather key thing, and something that's been in progress for several releases here, is this idea of truly dynamic nodes. Slurm's architecture from a very early point assumed a very static definition and static mapping of compute nodes in the system. That let us take a lot of performance shortcuts with how scheduling and communication works within the cluster, but it's always meant that it's been frustrating to add and remove nodes out of your Slurm cluster. The idea behind this dynamic nodes is to give people a way to very easily define new nodes, add them into the system, as well as remove them when necessary. I wouldn't say we're completely done with this yet. There are some important caveats, especially Nick was talking a lot around how tree width and the communication patterns within Slurm work. We may be making some future adjustments there to try and better allow for MPI-style workloads in this type of dynamicism. But at least for especially cloud environments with a high level of ephemerality to the compute nodes, this makes things a lot simpler and makes Slurm a lot more capable of managing those environments with a lot less aggravation. So I'd encourage you, if you haven't looked, to take a look at Nick's presentation from earlier, where he goes through some working examples of how to set up and get this working. Another thing that came in here, some license improvements. These are actually, I'm going to skip that slide. That slide should not sit there. That is actually future work in 23.02 that's coming in. Slurm's REST API saw some minor updates as well. I'm not going to try and cover those here today. The Open API does have its own set of release notes now that is tracked and managed as we do push and evolve that API. So I'd encourage you to take a look there, especially if you're actively developing against it. Okay, that does it for 22.05. Are there questions on that 22.05 release before I move into the future roadmap? Not seeing any, so I'm going to move forward. So, in conjunction with some of that discussion around the idea of better backfill planning for licenses is the idea of preempting licenses. Currently in Slurm, you can't preempt to try and reclaim licenses from a job. So if you have a higher priority job that's blocked waiting on available licenses, it's going to be blocked. It does not have a way to go and identify target jobs to preempt to try to reclaim their licenses from them. So for the 23.02 release, this is something we're exploring and should have in there. Especially we found for systems that are using those licenses to model not just software licenses, but other cluster resources. This is kind of critical to keeping that system behaving as people expect. Another thing that's coming in, and Nate was talking about extensively earlier in his presentation, is this idea of SC run, where Slurm can directly launch and manage OCI compliant containers. To date in Slurm, we do have a -- container option where Slurm can mount an unpacked container image. This gives us more sort of direct capabilities to integrate with different platforms and build off of that expected crun interface and push forward on that direction. I mentioned slurmscriptd earlier. One of the other parts here we are continuing to push this is to move hopefully almost all the external hooks from the Slurm controller over to the scriptd. Again, there's some massive performance benefits for us being able to do that help a lot in higher throughput environments. Another thing coming in, this AllowAccounts is an access control that you can use on the partition. One somewhat common request we've had, and something that we have only just gotten around to, sadly, is the idea of having it recurse automatically. So in Slurm, every account has a parent account up until the root level of your association hierarchy. We found it would be very convenient for a lot of the way that sites set up and think about and manage the access control to these partitions if we just allow a parent account to propagate its access into a given partition automatically. That way you can just set the parent account here. You don't have to worry about micromanaging the individual account membership at a much more granular level. And then beyond. I do have to apologize. Obviously, the roadmap here is not super long. I'll note that the only things I actually include here are stuff we are contracted and obligated to deliver in the 23.02 release. Do expect some other stuff to come in. Contracting delays. It means these slides are a little sparser than I would like at this point in time. But there's a few other things that will come into that 23.02 release. And I did want to highlight just a couple things that we are working on even longer term, potentially in the 23.11 release. Especially, this has been a very long-standing concern, is this idea of fixing scontrol reconfigure. And make it sighup and just restarting the various Slurm daemons sort of all semantically behave the same. Right now, scontrol reconfigure can be used to do some limited configuration updates. I'll admit that which updates it can successfully do is mostly undocumented and is rather hard to intuit. A number of different configuration values are cached in various places in the daemons in locations that don't respect the scontrol reconfigure call. And the scontrol reconfigure structurally has not been allowed to make changes to the plugin stacks if it needs to modify, for example, the task plugins. The slurmds can't change that on the fly. What we're looking at doing longer term here is pivoting away from that current model to allow it to spawn off a new child, to ensure that that child will be prepared to take over the process and run successfully, which will also allow it to change the plugins, which is something it can't technically do today. And as part of that, do a configuration sanity check to make sure that new child, either Slurm controller or slurmd process or slurmdbd process, make sure that that is actually alive and that it hasn't hit some sort of fatal warning or had some other issue bootstrapping itself. That's kind of one of the biggest caveats to date is if you make some sort of relatively innocuous mistake in the configuration file and do an scontrol reconfigure, all of a sudden the slurmd processes throughout your entire cluster might turn off. They may all print one last fatal warning message into the log file saying, hey, your configuration's not working for me. I can't continue starting up. And then nothing's responding to a successive scontrol reconfigure when you actually fix that. So we're hoping to kind of address all of those common caveats, common gotchas, and move past this to letting scontrol reconfigure actually do kind of what people expect it to. One nice side effect of a lot of this work is it should be possible to give people an explicit configuration check option to do a explicit sanity check to make sure the configuration syntax looks valid, that the plugins specified in there all appear to at least be able to bootstrap themselves, and that there's not something lingering that's immediately going to offline your system. And with that, I'm going to move on to any further questions here. I know there's about a 5-second or so delay, so I'm just going to stare at chat for about 10-15 seconds, see if anything trickles in. What am I drinking? There's the camera. Slurm, obviously. Cool. So, with no further questions, I do want to thank all of the presenters, especially to the community presenters who pivoted into this at the last minute. As many of you may know, we were originally intending to do this in person this year, but had to make a very last-minute switch online. I greatly appreciate the presenters for being willing to submit recordings and slide decks so that we could get those up online. All of the slides from the presentations today are going to be up on the Slurm publication archive. Actually, they are already there as I'm saying this. I do have to say there is, again, one last presentation that will be available at 2 p.m. On running specific workloads on AWS. That video will just be available in its entirety at 2 p.m. It's not going to run as a premiere or as a live stream like everything else this morning has. But again, thank you to all the presenters. Next events, we will be at SC22 in Dallas. The Slurm booth will be 1043. I haven't looked at the map. It's somewhere. Come find us. And then we are expecting and committing to SLUG'22 being in person. It will be held in September 2023. We will get the dates locked down, and we've learned that we need to avoid co-scheduling or conflicting with NVIDIA's GTC conference, so we'll make sure not to collide with that again. Look for announcements and a call for papers on the Slurm users and Slurm announce mailing lists sometime in the spring once we get the dates locked down. And with that, thank you guys all. It's been great having Slug again, if not quite in the forum we originally set out to. But I hope this has all been useful and valuable to you guys. And I certainly welcome any concerns, feedback, or comments direct to my email if you have any. So with that, thank you all.